Zonda International once again presents the Remarkable Women Powerful Stories webinar series, and I welcome you to my conversation with Sue Middleton, who is recognised as an entrepreneur, a skilled advocate, and as a highly influential leader within regional and rural Australia. There's a wealth of connections in the agribusiness, food and regional development sectors throughout Western Australia and, of course, our whole nation, Australia. I'm Lynn Foley, and I'm truly privileged to speak with the remarkable women who are so generous with their stories and with their time. I wish to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet today and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and also pay that respect to any First Nations people present. Zonda International is a leading global organisation working together to build a better world for women and girls. So Sue, I warmly welcome you to our conversation today.
Thank you, Lynn.
Coming to us from Perth in Western Australia, and as I often am, I'm here in Toowoomba in Queensland, Australia. So it's lovely to speak to a fellow countrywoman.
Yeah, you too, Lynn.
So as I begin, I thought we'd start with when we first met a little while back. It became really clear to me that your passion for rural and regional community development and your skill as a leader and entrepreneur started way early in your life. I'd love to start our conversation with how and where this story began, Sue.
Look, I was raised on a beef and cropping farm near a little community in Queensland called Chinchilla, which many people will know. So I grew up in a rural community and, you know, in a kind of a community where I felt like you could, the way I described it, you could grab any woman's skirt and someone would look after you. It was incredibly safe. It was, you know, at the time I felt it was, you know, just the perfect childhood. I gravitated towards everything Dad did. And I did that, I think, because he was out on the farm and I saw the farm and the outdoor stuff as a lot of fun. And so I spent a lot of time shadowing Dad. My dad was the Shire president. And now for people who, you know, come from a different country, this is probably akin to being like a local government level, so not state or federal. And Dad was the Shire president, and so lots of people would ring him up and ask him lots of questions. And I always felt as a child, because I would sit on the floor of the office and listen to Dad, I always felt like my dad knew everything and, you know, was really connected and could solve everyone's problems. In fact, I remember when I was 8 years old, I said to someone said to me, "What does your dad do?" And I said, "Oh, I think he runs town," because he just seemed to be the person everyone went to. And so I got this really early, I guess, example of powerful leadership at a really local level. And I think that really stuck with me as being something that I was really attracted to. So that was kind of, I think, the childhood and the, you know, that great love for not just the land, which Dad also did kind of help me learn about and educated us about the trees and the birds and systems. So I got this love for agriculture and I got this love for rural communities, and then I got this great example of leadership inside of that as well.
Wow, so it's really interesting. I think when we're little people, we often think our mothers or our fathers know everything, or they can solve every problem in the world, don't we? So it's interesting that in your case it was your dad. So I recall that your university study was in the areas of both science and business. And so I'm really interested in hearing why you chose each of these and how your school days and pathway between those two disciplines has supported you in the career you've chosen so far. I think there's a lovely story in there somewhere about a sunset. Maybe?
Yeah, I think I had a kind of I would say I was less directed and purposeful when I was young. I did, however, set myself a goal at 22, which I'll tell you about in a moment, and it relates to the sunset story. But at school, I did math science, and I did math science because I enjoyed it. And I remember when I was in year 12 and, you know, you're working out what you're going to choose to do, what my kind of thing, because I'd done some work at the wheat research facility in Toowoomba, actually, because I went to school in Toowoomba, where you're from, Lynn. And I had this kind of goal, or this, you know, big, you know, kind of idea at the time that I could breed the wheat that would feed the world. And so I went off into science because that's naturally what you would send a kid to do who had that goal. But actually, the key part of what I had in my head was the idea of feeding the world. And that sort of came into the second thing that I chose to do. But I didn't enjoy science. And it was the first time in my life where I'd actually had an experience where I felt like I didn't prosper. I wasn't successful. And it was, at a very young age, that's a really painful thing to go through. But what it enabled me to do was to then sit down and say, what is it that I want to do? And I did a jump right to another institution, which is part of University of Queensland, Gatton College, and I started doing a Bachelor of Business, which I absolutely loved. And the reason I loved business was it brought out my entrepreneurial side. And so I got to do a whole range of things, also because I was on a campus which operated like a country town in many ways. And I became the social activities director for the student union. And so I got into some early advocacy issues and so learned about how to, I started to prove up some of my own leadership skills. And the social activities role was really important because, at uni, that's what everything revolves around, either study or your social life. I learned how to organise, and I learned how to, I think the really important thing for me at the time was I was starting to learn to stand up for what I thought was important, and I was starting to align my actions around my values. That was very early on though. But then, so to leap forward, I still didn't know what I wanted to do at that point in time, but what I did was took on a job doing research assistant work for the university. And I was living in Brisbane, and I was every night I would try and get up Mount Cootha, which is a large mountain in Brisbane. And my reason for wanting to do that is that I wanted to see the sunset over land. And this one night, I was racing up and I was speeding, and a policeman pulled me up. And as they do in Australia, they always ask you, what is your reason for speeding? And I said, I need to get up the mountain because I have to see the sunset over land. And he said to me, well, you might want to have a think about that, because if you're living in Brisbane and you need to see the sunset over land, that's probably not all going to work together, and I'm going to let you off. So I didn't get the speeding fine, but I got some wise words from a wise man, and I went up the top of the mountain, and I did actually have an epiphany on the top of the mountain where I went, I actually have to go out into the communities that I care about, which is rural Australia, and take some of these early skills that I'd learned, because this is actually what I care about. I care about the future of rural Australia, and I set myself a very daggy goal at the time of making rural Australia prosperous. That's what I would dedicate my life to, and that all happened on the top of the mountain, and I've really been doing that ever since.
So your feed the world morphed or matured or sophisticated into that goal, and which has become your life's goal. So they're a bit connected though, aren't they?
Well, they're all connected because that's what agriculture does. It actually feeds the world. But there's lots of systems and, like, for example, rural communities and supply chains around ag that, so it wasn't just the actual job of doing research to feed the world. It was more about, the business systems that would help to feed the world.
Absolutely. And with your study in that area. So after all this early family life here in Queensland, we think it's beautiful one day, perfect the next here in Queensland. And this is where I give the plug for 2024, when the Zonda International Convention will be in Brisbane, our capital city. But after your time here in Queensland, what took you to Western Australia, a 5-hour flight away on the other side of our beautiful country, into wheat farming, and further then on your pathway of entrepreneurship and advocacy?
Yeah, look, it was the late 90s, and all of the kind of work that we'd done in Queensland, I was working out in Western Queensland at this time around revitalising rural communities. That this was a really big topic at the time. And I went to Western Australia to speak at a conference, and at that time, Western Australia was really starting to get a great program off the ground, which went on to become, it started off being, it was doing more with agriculture. It was all about value-adding agriculture, and then it went on to become Progress Rural WA. And I went over there to speak at the conference and just said, I love this. I love what they're doing. I'm coming back to work here. And so I went home, packed my bags, and was in Western Australia within 6 weeks. So, you know,
Wow.
poor mum who'd already had me do the move out to Western Queensland was where she was like, oh no, your life's going to be over. You're going to marry a grazier. I'll never see you again. And then I kind of doubled down on that. I didn't marry a grazier mum. I went to Western Australia instead. But I became the coordinator, state coordinator of a program called Community Builders. And what was great about that was that I knew how to revitalise one community. And what I had to then learn to do was how to do this in 100 communities at once, because that's what the program was all
Mm.
about. And so I had learned how to be the hand, and then I had to learn how to do the work that the elbow does, because the elbow enables the hand.
Mm.
And then I jumped from the elbow up to the shoulder. And that was kind of like my journey of learning what's the enabling things that enable this to happen in more communities at once. So, in effect, in business terms, I learned how to scale up a skill and a development process that I had already
Mm-hmm.
learned at a local level. So, WA, I still have this theory if I hadn't gone to WA, I would never have learned how to do that. And that was a really important part of my growth and my journey.
And that's that opportunity. It's the opportunity that you embraced. You perhaps didn't go looking for it, but it was there and you grabbed it. Is that one way
Yeah.
of looking at it?
And I also think it's really important that when that opportunity comes along, it will actually look like something that's scary. You know, it'll look like something that's risky. Everyone in your life will probably say, oh gosh, don't do that. And these are trusted people you love and trust will say, gosh, no. And then you have to really figure out if that aligns with your purpose and helps you to achieve your purpose, because you have to reassure everyone in your life this is going to be okay. Incidentally, going back to Mum's fear about me marrying a grazier and disappearing into Western Queensland, when I got to Western Australia, I was working across a range of different communities, and I met my husband 8 months into the 1 year contract that I had. And I met him because I fell down a flight of stairs in the airport, and I met him at the bottom of the stairs. And I think it's just like another story about when opportunity knocks, because we didn't necessarily hit it off straight away, but we kept in contact, and that kind of relationship then became a defining part of the next stage of my life, because I became part of Michael's family farm. I became a stepmother of 3 kids, and I became part of a small rural community. And so I kind of did a whole range of different things that I said I would never do, because I said I was never getting married and I was never having kids. And suddenly I
you
was
weren't
like,
going to marry a grazier or a wheat farmer
I
either, were
wasn't
you?
going to marry, I was never going to marry a farmer. And then suddenly I was like, hello, all of those things. So I guess my other kind of life lesson is that don't shut out any opportunities. There'll be the things that, in a joking way, you'll say to your friends, oh God, I'd never do that. But the reality is you may very well do them, and they may become the defining part of your life and the best thing that ever happened to you.
And maybe that's also about being open. Like I can't think of any other words. So it's like that openness to something new and different and challenging and fun, rather than sticking in our lane. Or sticking in a lane.
Leaning into change. Do things that make you uncomfortable. The growth lives in the uncomfortable things. It doesn't live in the status quo.
And that's a beautiful sentence of describing it. We have to be uncomfortable to grow, and we have to be uncomfortable to learn. Yep. Sometimes that hurts a lot, but in the end, it's usually fairly useful to us in life. Yes. So now, absolutely. So nowadays, you're truly immersed in organisations focused on how to use technology as a lever for building community resilience, and to focus on how the ag sector or the agriculture sector can support the reduction of global warming. And I was really interested when we first talked in this juxtaposition, or the alignment of those two things. Can you talk with me about how you approach this with your work, and the difference you believe you and your organisations are able to make in this space too?
Yeah, so I do this both professionally and in a volunteer capacity, because I think it's so important. Ag tech, so in Australia we have around, agriculture is around about a $60 to $70 billion industry per year. That's our output. And we have this goal in Australia that we've set collectively, is that we will get to 100 billion. And the the best way for us, or I guess the thing that we could do that we can invest in that gives us the quickest value uplift to the 100 billion is ag tech. And it is the only thing that can get us to the 100 billion at the speed and the pace at which we've defined. But the reason that ag tech's not just about, lifting productivity, it's actually about its capacity to help us to monitor things in field that tell us whether we're successfully decarbonising. And I think one of the imperatives for ag, it's an important sector. It not only does it feed the world, but it's an important employer. It's, usually the underpinning industry in most of rural, regional, and remote communities across the world. It's a really big employer of women as well. Women produce 51% of the farm output in Australia, so it's really important at a number of different levels. But decarbonising is the imperative, because if we look at where we're heading as a world, every industry has to be on the pathway to not just net zero, but eventually zero, and then even becoming carbon positive. So without ag tech, we actually can't monitor what we're doing around decarbonising. And so it's really critical, because for us, decarbonising is going to be around how we apply fertilisers, what's happening in our soils, how we're monitoring and looking after the conditions of biodiversity or building more biodiversity, what's happening with waterways and other ecosystems. And so I guess this is where the science comes in. Ag tech gives you the capacity as a farmer to be able to look after your systems and explain your systems to either people who are consuming your product, or it could be that you're explaining your system to someone who wants to buy an offset from you. And so we're talking a lot in ag at the moment about offsets and insetting. Insetting's about retaining your credits, because you're going to need it to be able to sell your product into a world that's really informed around decarbonisation. And ag tech is the pathway. So we're involved in a number of professional projects. And I'll give you just one quick example. We work for an organisation called AgriFutures, which is a national research and development organisation in Australia. And we've designed their farmer tech uptake program. And it's the one part of it that we've designed is the workshop that helps farmers to learn to define. Basically, they build a farm tech plan, and it helps them to define how to adopt ag tech, because that's the big barrier in Australian agriculture at the moment, is farmers adopting ag tech. And for lots of good reasons, there's lots of really quite real barriers for them. And so then at a volunteer level, as an example, myself and some other farmers formed a group called Ag Zero 2030 in Western Australia, and we did that because we wanted to signal to people that ag was up for the change, and that agriculture is not going to be a laggard around decarbonising. And we do positive messaging. We organise events which bring the industry together to talk about what their goals are, what the targets are, and then we also have a view around new developments, and e.g., I'd say gas developments in Western Australia. We have a view around whether they're going to prevent us getting to the position we need to be by 2050. And so we also do a little bit of advocacy and sometimes influencing, and sometimes we're actually out there being more activists as well. Yeah, so it's been really exciting having both strands, because you get to work on the stuff where you can change the kind of the structural foundations and tackle some of the difficult barriers, but then also it's really fun being part of a group that is passionate and cares about the transition.
So I'm going to flip the place I was going to ask this question of you, Sue, because I think it fits here. So how did you go about getting that self-confidence, the self-belief that exudes from you, claim your space and find the power of your voice? Because to start where we start, and then you came through into what you call advocacy and at times activism, and you're working in a fairly historically male-dominated space, if I might use that terminology, where women are over and over again nowadays emerging as leaders, and are already leaders, but there's a lot of emerging leaders coming in. I just wonder how you did that, and then I'll probably then wander into the notion of gender equity and the place of women in ag too as well.
It is really important, actually. People ask me, why are you always banging on about women? But women can typically be change agents. I mean, one of the great things about being a woman, this is all going to sound like a list of terrible things, but it's actually a list of good things, is that people will underestimate you. Because they underestimate you, they don't see you coming, and you get to get into environments, because typically, and certainly my skills, to your question about how did I learn to become confident, is I'm a natural born collaborator. I really like learning from other people. I like being in group environments. I'm a trained professional facilitator, so I know how to bring out the best in group environments. And I really trust the group can solve problems. So what I tend to do is I build teams and I build networks, and that's really critical in environments which are male dominated. The reason it's critical is because in any kind of area where the culture is around, and let's just say ag as an example, where men are definitely dominant in leadership areas, the culture will be competitive. And so the opposite of being competitive and being ego driven is to be collaborative, and to be the person who's building the networks and bringing people together to solve gnarly problems. The really difficult problems aren't solved by focusing on any one issue, which is also kind of what you get when you get that kind of dominant culture, is you get siloed thinking. And so there's a lot of power in being in the space in between. So where did I get my confidence from? I got my confidence from failing, to be absolutely blunt. I got my confidence from having the wind knocked out of me, from being in environments where, I was, I guess, put in situations where people have attacked me. I've been in, and I do pick really tough topics to act on as well. And so the thing that gets me through those moments is my network of people behind me. And so I call on what I call my girl gang to help me when I go into the tough fights. And that's kind of, my confidence has come from being in real life situations where I had to really kind of step up. I do this little thing. I have mantras which help me in any situation where feeling like I have to do something and I don't have the confidence to do it. I create a possibility for myself. So I say who I am is the possibility of power, freedom, and love, which is what I want to bring to every room. And so I step into my possibility and I kind of put the armor on and I jump into the job. Now, confidence is really what I've discovered about confidence. It's really inspiring, and people are drawn to it and they're magnetized by it. And I find it's an incredibly important characteristic if you want people to come together around an issue to solve a problem, because they need to feel confident that you are the person, say if you're mapping out, what a plan is to decarbonise by a certain date, they need to have confidence that that can be done. So I think that networking is incredibly important. And for me, for women to support each other, because we bring collaboration to the room, that's how the big problems are going to be solved. So early on, did I have the confidence? I think that I have always aimed higher. My kind of view is aim really high and you'll get knocked down and you'll fail. But if you learn your lessons from failing, often what happens is you can then see the pathway. As you go, I tried it this way. Oh God, that was really bad. Dust yourself off and then go, okay, I can now see where I need to go, but I need to potentially align with other forms of power or find another way into that room, or I have to meet other people or whatever it is and be strategic about that.
In my last interview, I spoke to a 24-year-old young woman from here in Australia, and she said, in the end, I've already figured it out. I've just got to be myself.
Oh, yeah.
Be myself.
Yeah, totally. I would say 100%. The one thing that that will get, I think the thing that inspires most is when people show their vulnerability, and being yourself is to be incredibly vulnerable in a group of people. And if you can do that and overcome your great fear of, I think Brené Brown's described this really well, that kind of whole thing we're really scared of is shame. And so to overcome that, other people watch you and then go, well, I can actually try and do what I want to do because I just saw that person do that. It's really powerful. It's really powerful modeling.
We have more chance of being different or what we think we want to be if we've seen other people do it, and then we make our own way through it. We don't do what other people do, but we make our own way through it because we're more confident.
Yeah. There's this thing that they say that women look ahead and they see if there's a woman there ahead of them, which is why that's an incredibly important activity for other women, is to pull women behind you. I call it the snakes and ladders game. And I say, the way I describe it is, am I building a ladder? Am I pulling other women up that ladder? Am I helping women when they get to the top of the ladder to get in the door? Am I doing all of those things? Because if I'm the type of woman that's just pushing them down the snake, then, you know, I am not the person who is going to change any of these really tough issues. And that means I'm not being my possibility as well. So I always think of it as a ladder.
And we can't do it ourselves. Like, we have to have other women around us and we have to bring them through with us. And I've noticed that too as I pursue life. And, you know, eventually your life motto becomes, well, my job is to lift up other women and make sure they're there. Yeah. I've stood on the shoulders of great women, and I need people to stand on my shoulders so they can be the best they can be. Okay, let's switch topics. I'm really interested in telecommunications, and I know in our country, and I'm not sure about every other country around the world, telecommunications these days are the heart and soul of life. And then we have large regional and rural communities at a distance from our major cities and towns in our country. How do you believe the current state of this may be inhibiting growth in the sector and the social and economic lives of those who live and work in regional, rural and remote communities?
So look, this is my absolute hobby horse. So I'm going to try and do this quickly and I'll possibly fail. But one of the kind of the biggest constraints to ag tech, the kind of the topic I was talking about before, or any other things that really matter, you know, the working from home trend, or, you know, rural health being delivered online. I could just go on and on and on about all of the drivers for having fast enterprise grade broadband. Is underlying infrastructure. Now, one of the problems we had in Australia, and I have looked around the world, and I think it is unique to Australia, is that we relied upon a satellite service and then the rollout of the national broadband to regional communities, and we didn't innovate enough early enough in Australia. It's taken an entrepreneur from the other side of the world, who everyone will know who I'm talking about when I say is an entrepreneur in the electric vehicle space, to come in and put the first low Earth orbiting satellite system in place in Australia, which has revolutionised people's capacity to get high-speed data. It's certainly latency is always an issue on satellites, but it's, you know, it's fairly decent around latency, and it has completely, and we've also got any amount of data that you want. So we lived on data cap services in Australia in rural Australia until probably about, I'm going to say 5 to 7 years ago, when they brought the second satellite in, which rural Australians could access. So mobile networks, we've done an enormous amount of work trying to build mobile networks in rural and regional Australia, but it's a big country. And the actual model is very, you know, the way I would describe it is it's a very thin market out in rural and regional. So we should have innovated earlier. We've been, state governments, probably even federal governments have been paying the major telcos to put mobile towers in, which haven't been universal access. So we've got market dominance in some areas, and once that market dominance occurs, there's no incentive for them to innovate and to, you know, either lift speeds or deal with congestion. We've got major mobile tower congestion issues across rural and regional Australia, and the telcos have pretty much said in the latest, you know, regional telecommunications review I was involved in, that they have no real plan or investment to fix it. So it means in that case, what you have to do is innovate, and there's been a lot of innovation in the last mile space and lots of secondary telcos. and lots of farmers that have been solving this for themselves. But still, as a nation, we just missed big opportunities to solve this. And I don't think that low Earth orbiting satellites are the only solution. They're just the solution for now. We need to keep working on this area. It needs to get a lot more investment than it does. I mean, the size of the prize in Western Australia, we had a project which we nearly got funded and off the ground. It got unfortunately collapsed by one of the governments removed their commitment. But, you know, the size of the prize is probably around 10 billion for Australia, which if you look at what the government's going to recoup from the super changes, the superannuation changes they're talking about, 10 billion is probably doable.
And it's it really impacts, I think, for people who live in the cities and or in the eastern and western seaboards where, you know, big regional towns or cities and in the capital cities, the thought of not having connectivity, but you can drive within, you know, 20 kilometres of a town just up the road here and not have connectivity for 100 kilometres. And, you know, that's an example. Whereas I know when we travel in the Northern Hemisphere and other countries or even around Asia, you never lose connectivity. So it's a really interesting problem that Australia's struggled with for a long time. And it particularly affects regional and rural communities.
Totally, Lynn, and it determines where you live. So people will actually make decisions about investing in the regions, which is, you know, really what we want. The regions are the powerhouse of Australia. They're where all the primary production occurs. And whilst we do have, you know, in many parts of Australia, we've got good, solid economic diversification. I'll give you the example in Western Australia. All the regions are still the major drivers and where the primary production occurs, which drives the cities. So not addressing this in our regions and not really empowering our regions with the best connectivity that we can is insanity in economic terms. It is like kind of putting your foot on the hose of the most important part of Australia.
But it also hits home when we have one of our many natural disasters, which tend to happen not just in the cities, they happen in rural and regional areas. And then the inability to be able to just stay connected to make things change and happen is so important. Absolutely. So it's a great short conversation we've had about a very vexed and complicated problem. But it's good to raise it, I think, in this venue. So I'll circle back now to the whole notion of gender, not just throughout the agricultural and you know, whole pastoral space, but more broadly. That notion that most of us believe that until we get to 50% female representation in politics, boards and decision-making tables, not just in our country, but across the world, you know, we're missing out. We're missing out on the intellect. We're missing out on the experience of up to half of our population. So I'm wondering what your thoughts are about that and the barriers of getting us to this notion of gender parity that the World Economic Forum tells us is still more than 100 years away globally. Some countries are well and truly close to it, like New Zealand. Other countries aren't, and some of the Scandinavian countries. So I wonder, just open question to you, some thoughts on all of that.
Yeah, look, it's incredibly important. My way of describing it when people say, what do you think about, you know, where we are with leadership on boards in agriculture, is I say it needs to reflect the participation in the industry. So if, you know, 51% of your industry participants are women, and then you get up to the leadership level and there's less than 8%, which is the case in some of our, you know, it tends to happen. The government boards tend to be better because they have mandated 40%. And so the mandating requires people to go out and look for the women. One of the key barriers that I discovered when I was a Rural Woman of the Year in 2010 is that women are invisible. And so it is actually harder to find the women, and it's because people aren't networked into the women's networks typically. So it's a bit like the ladder again, you know, like we have to all be building the ladders so that we can get the women into those positions. So then sometimes the flow of women hasn't been happening as well, and some of the barriers back around, you know, in mid-career around childcare and flexible workplaces, you know, all that's really quite important. So they're quite structural things that have to be solved. And I'll give you the example of every rural community I've worked in. I've either helped to build a childcare service or built a childcare centre, because childcare has been done so poorly in rural and regional Australia. So there's very real barriers for women that we can solve. But then if you then go to, things around pay gap, the importance around being able to solve pay gap is transparency. And so some of the reporting requirements that are coming in now are really helping to show the disparity between what women and men are paid in organisations. And that's important because that goes to the future financial health of women and what their retirement and what their later years look like. So that's an important flow through. But I think then the other thing is that, it's important to know what's the intervention, and because what's the barrier and then what's the intervention that you're trying to put in place to solve a particular problem. I'll give you one example of an area I've been involved in agriculture is raising the issue around sexual harassment, because one of the barriers for women advancing is actually that they experience harassment in the workplace, which then affects their career development, and it then affects also just their desire and motivation to be involved. And so if we want to get to 51%, which is where we actually should be if we're going to represent, if we're going to be adequately representing the participation of the industry, we need to do a lot more about tackling some of those really thorny issues. And they're not immediately obvious to people who are in organisations who are doing recruiting, for instance. They don't understand that those are the barriers that are stopping women applying, or those are the barriers that are stopping women putting their names forward for promotion. So all of those things you can work on. They're all very doable, but, often we're just back at the first conversation, which is, why does this matter? Why do we need more women in the decision and the leadership kind of making roles? And that's because they bring an enormous amount of talent, and diversity helps decision making. We know that the worst performing boards in Australia are all one gender, male or female, doesn't matter. Best performing boards have the greatest diversity, and that research has been in for some time, and we know it. We actually need to learn how to live it in our companies and in our organisations.
And it's also about, isn't it, about women feeling as though they need to negotiate harder for equal pay. They feel they have to do all of that. And the structure, from my perspective, is we've spent a lot of energy in the last 20 years or more around the world preparing women, giving women skills, doing a whole lot of leadership activities for women. You've been involved in them. I have them. I run some still. But that's only part of the issue, because women will still run into those structural barriers. They'll still run into, if we rebirth the glass ceiling, they'll still run into all those barriers that stop them or push them down. And often, for some of us who might have broken through, we have to make sure, you said it earlier, bring women with us, because otherwise only a certain group of women are the ones that are being tagged because they're visible. And we have all this invisible talent that we're bringing through. There are so many areas of it. So, yeah, it's hard to know, isn't it? Because as you or I are the one fish trying to make a difference, one woman at a time, or a group of women at a time. But if everyone did that and called out this behaviour, I think we'd be much further down the tracks too.
Yeah, I think collectively, though, explaining why it matters and how it makes a difference is important, but then also doing it is really important. So, even though sometimes you do feel like you're the only one who might be the voice, there's structural ways you can do this. When you get onto a board, get onto the nominations committee, because the nominations committee put the next people on the board. I kind of have this little thing. If I typically, for the 20 years of my life, I was the only woman on every board room I was in. And so I would go, I have to leave here with 2 women in this room, because once there's 2 women, the 2 women can get 4 women. And don't be a woman who shuts other women out of opportunities. When you're in a room, you can't capture every, my example, Rural Woman of the Year, I couldn't capture all the opportunities that were being thrown at me, because I suddenly became visible. I didn't need my capability built. I was extremely capable, but I had to be seen. And once I was seen, the avalanche of things that came to me. So my process was to say, I can't do that for you, but I know a perfect person who can. Grab out of my network this person and handhold them to the opportunity. and hand-holding's often necessary because we do sometimes lack confidence, or we sometimes have hits that affect our confidence as well. So, and it happens to all of us. But I think that process of being really active around enabling women, because I call it in agriculture the grass ceiling, not the glass ceiling. And that term was first, I have to acknowledge it, as a researcher called Margaret Alston first talked about this barrier for women in agriculture. The barriers are real. So this whole idea of because you've done, you're good at what you do and you're meritorious, that you're going to get in there. Merit is the bottom rung of the ladder. It's absolutely the bottom rung, and you've got to get to the top of the ladder, and the rungs in between are going to be about, all of those things that we've talked about today. They're really critical, and I meet lots of wonderful young women who say to me, don't you think it should just be based on merit? And I thought, if I thought merit was going to get you there, I'd just say go for merit, but it's not going to get you there.
Not on its own. You have to have that as the basis.
Yeah,
you have to have merit, but not on its own.
Yeah,
yes,
totally.
So we've talked a lot in our conversation so far around the notion of mentoring and role models. So, and I know your, first role model and mentor was probably your dad and others around you. But I'm wondering, have you had a mentor or role model yourself as an adult, and more recently that's lifted you up along the way?
Yeah, totally. I had a really important experience when I was in my late 20s, early 30s. My first board that I was on was the Regional Women's Advisory Council. We were advising the Australian government at the time, and my chair of that board was Cathy McGowan. And for people who don't know Cathy in other countries, she's been an incredible change agent and person in rural and regional Australia who's completely shaken up the political system and, ensured that rural and regional people get a say in our parliament. So that was really important for me because Cathy taught me so many important things, and she actively mentored me through that time, and we've stayed friends as well. And through the friendship, I also still get lots of what I call being Cathy'd, which is Cathy will be like, what Cathy fundamentally is about is not being powerless around a thing that needs to be changed. If you need to align with power to change it, because that's what the environment requires, that's one of the things she does really well, but she's also highly disruptive. But she's disruptive in the most respectful way I've ever seen anyone change environments. And so I think I learned a lot about power from Cathy, and I learned a lot about, really leaning into your own self-power and understanding those two things, incredibly important. And I think the other thing probably that I got from that really early relationship with Cathy was she taught me to value myself. And at the time when I met Cathy, I was very much I'm just this and I'm just that. And, I had a lot of justs in my life. And Cathy was really, really blunt with me one day. She said, if you don't learn to value yourself, no one else will. And it just stuck with me. No more just.
And no more I'm sorry.
And, they still sneak out from time to time, but I hear them. And I go, right, no, Sue, come on. And so I think that they're really important lessons. And if I could, myself, I've then gone on to mentor other young women. If I could pass those same lessons on that have been passed to me, like the women, you said this, we stand on others' shoulders, and I've been able to stand on Cathy's shoulders. And then what we're doing, we're like a human pyramid. I'm pulling other young women up to stand on my shoulders because they will be the ones who will create the next future. I just want to make sure that I'm one of the people who's pulling them up, and I want to be one of the people who's working on the causes that matter to them, so that they know that, e.g. climate change, that our generation, we may not have got onto it early enough, but we're not going to let them down. Absolutely.
Absolutely on that one. We're starting to run out of time a little bit, Sue, so I want to take us quickly into challenges, life challenges. Have you got any thoughts about how you tackle any life challenges or barriers that come at you?
Yeah, look, I talked a bit about failure before. So failure is really critical if you're going to grow, but you also need to have some kind of support network around you that helps you after you've had a failure, because it can be really personally devastating. And so I think it's really important to regroup, and to look after yourself. So it took me a long time to learn this, that self-care is actually, it's like when you're on the plane and it says fit your own mask before fitting the mask of the people with you. That's really critical. You've got to fit your own mask. And so you need to be investing in the things that are helping you to be able to, have the resilience and have the strength and to build that self-power. So it's really important. Self-care is not negotiable. It's really important that you're doing whatever the learning activities are that will help you. You're doing your networking and you're actively investing in networking and meeting key people, and that you're doing all the stuff that helps you to, there's things that ground you, there's things that really, make you feel like you've got that sense of peace and contentment, and, that you feel good about yourself. Absolutely, whatever those things are for you, make sure you invest a big chunk of your time to making sure that occurs, because that's really important. And once again, girl gang, I would not be where I am and doing the things I am doing without my girl gang. Really important to have good friends who love and support you, and to have your family around you as well.
It's so important, and to acknowledge that we do need that. We can't do it alone, and we're not 10 foot tall and bulletproof all of the time. So I'm going to swing straight into, what's your greatest gift as a leader, as a woman who's very visible? What's your greatest gift?
Courage, without a doubt, courage. Yeah, because I try very hard to tackle the hard things. I try not to leave them to other people, and that really requires a lot of courage. All the other things I've talked about, like collaboration, good listening skills, they're all the things that come after courage.
Absolutely. So what's next? You've got a lot of things I know you're playing with and working with in family, but what's next for you, and where do you get that next uplift in the power of your voice and your advocacy and your disruption and your activism?
It's such a good question. Look, I think probably professionally, and like we talked about that goal around decarbonising, I think that's definitely going to see me out, that goal. I think I'll work on that until I'm, pushing up daisies, or however it works. But then I think also the gender equity issue, I came to that late in life, but I think I've really begun to understand what an important leverage point it is to support and help and to be a powerful advocate for other women. So I think that, and making sure that if there's anything I can do for younger women and people who are coming into rural and regional Australia who want to play that same role, that advocacy role, and I think it's supporting other people. I want to lean into, I'm getting to the age now where I really want to lean into wisdom as well. And this is a topic I've only just started to play with, which is what is wisdom, and how can you bring wisdom to all of the things that you do, because you've been around a long time, you've got 40 years of experience, there's a lot you've learned. How can you then bring that and have that be something that is, part of your, your superhuman powers kind of thing? Because I don't want to waste being this age. I'm, not in the least bit concerned about aging, other than obviously, things don't start working quite as well as they used to. But other than that, I think all of those powers around aging, they're going to be really important.
And sometimes in the aging space, to wrap this with the aging theme, it's when the things don't work as well as they used to, it can sometimes get in the way of our self-confidence and our self-belief and who we are, and aging then can become the issue rather than remembering the person we are and the wisdom that we have. And yeah, I agree with you. Wisdom is so much worth exploring. I've spent a lot of time exploring that myself these days too. And I think that's a really lovely note for us to end our conversation on, that wisdom is what we gain through life. through living and having an experience, isn't it? So have you a final thought to leave our listeners with today?
Yeah, look, I think if I were to wrap all of those thoughts up, firstly, thank you, Lynn, for giving me the opportunity to do this self-reflection, because that's a really powerful tool and I really appreciate the opportunity. But I'd say don't wait for permission. This would be my big message. Confidence comes from tackling the hard things. And so if you can see an area where you can change, go for it. You know, actually just get out there and make it happen. Don't be stopped. There's going to be points where you kind of go, oh, well, this isn't working, and you're going to have to pivot and find another way to do it. But really believe in yourself and your power to change things, because you are if you can see the problem and you can see the solution, you are the person who is going to change it. Do not wait for permission.
Thank you, Sue. What a fabulous way to spend an hour. I've thoroughly enjoyed our conversation, and I know that you have too. Zonda International thanks you for being our friend, and thanks you for being our guest on today's program. So go well and safely into the next path of gaining more wisdom, and I'm sure we'll hear from you again. So to everyone watching us and listening today, please join me as the year progresses to hear the story of other remarkable women like Sue during our 2023 season. Please tell your friends, colleagues and families of our series.